Ladies and gentlemen, students and scholars, teachers and trainers, professors and professionals, listeners and learners, those who belong to the field of science, religion, spirituality, arts, commerce and engineering, the most honorable present Prime Minister Dr. Narendra Modi ji, respected ministers and doctors, honorable advocates, advertisers, administrators and advisors, respected fathers and mothers, affectionate sons and daughters. I, Dr. Rakesh from USA, heartily, cordially welcome all of you. Really nice time, nice place, nice section. You are listening the truth of language and literature. Literature opens our eyes. Our closed eyes can be opened through literature. The literature is the mirror of our society. For the development in the society, in our nation, it is necessary to know the fundamentals of literature. Our scholars and learners, those who are studying in the different universities, Cambridge, Oxford, Harvard, different universities of the world, they are studying in research point of view. So fundamentally, they know the law of nature. On that basis, we can count the blessings and grace of Lord. Who he was, who he is, and who he will in past, present, and future. That Almighty Lord who remains the same. He himself is omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, unchangeable, stable, immortal. Everything around us that we have, it has time duration, but Lord God, who has created the earth, the oceans, the sky, everything which is natural, made by Lord or God. Even man himself is the creation of Lord. In the form of God, he created this statue of human beings. Dear friends, we have our special task. Our ancestors, forefathers, foretellers, forecasters, messengers, free-thinkers, freedom fighters, those who came first on this land, they know that how was the Gurukul system in ancient time. There was only the education of philosophy, and our old age people were filled with a great vision in their life. They were filled with high attitude of life. It was the nature that filled them with the multi-cultured and multicolored forms. So dear friends, All over the world, we read different kind of literature. English is commonly read by all our scholars and learners, but the literature is different. One thing which is common, that is our human body. Every man's body is made by 5 elements: air, fire, soil, sky and water. Further, secondly, the works of this body is different. Everyone's actions are different. And if a man want to bring change, any revolutionary and visionary change, it is necessary that we are to change the action of our ideas. How do we think? It's also a great kind of training. It's a part of training. How to think, how to breathe. Dear friends, even superb and topmost degree of meditation is repetition of the words, thoughts, ideas of the past. For keeping our mind in present, we must concentrate upon the sound. This is the theory of attachment and disattachment, focus and defocus, that can be understood by our research scholars and founders of the different streams in the field of agriculture, industry, means of communication, means of transportation, in other all service sectors. It is required. Our innovative and inventive techniques can be applied for knowing the truth of science and spirituality, even language and literature. Dear friends, we are to concentrate upon the realism and idealism. Both are necessary in our life. Our life is the intermixing of realism and idealism. Sometimes we are not happy with our idealistic life, then we are to return towards our realistic life. And if we are not happy in our realistic life, we are to turn towards our idealistic life. This is the fluctuation in our life. So our lifestyle is having both the directions, by being theist and atheist, by being high and low, by being hot and cold, by being up and down. We feel so many changes. If there is no change, so there is no life. Nature also says that change is the rule of nature. So we must follow it, and we should appreciate, admire, praise the healthy words of God, healthy thoughts of Lord, healthy breaths of thought, and for everything that we have around us, that we study in English literature, language and grammar. In all the languages, everyone studies the literature, language and grammar. For knowing the truth of these basics, we must go through the sound and light. Because in the chapter of the Genesis, it is said that the sound, light, in the form of waves of sound and rays of light. We have around us so many celestial bodies in the form of God or Lord. We see, watch, listen, read and write about them. So these things are really praiseworthy and admirable. We are to count the blessings of Lord day to night and night to day. With our heart, with our mind, with our all internal organs, we are to count the uncountable and numberless power of Lord. It is our prime duty in our daily life. So dear friends, Further, you will study 18th century literature, 1700 to 1800, 18th century literature. We say it 18th century literature, Augustan or classical age. This is classical age, and it is also called by Augustan age. In India, from 1914 to 1947, we study Gandhism. The age of Gandhi means who was a prominent leader, hero, and actor of the politics, religious leader who provided the path of the truth and non-violence to the public. Likely that this age was occupied by Augustus, so it is known as Augustan age. The revolution of 1688, which banished the last of the Stuart kings and called William of Orange to the throne, marks the end of the long struggle for political freedom in England. Thereafter, the Englishman spent his tremendous energy, which his 4 years had largely spent in fighting for freedom, in endless political discussions and in efforts to improve his government in order to bring about reforms. Votes were now necessary, and to get votes, the people of England must be approached with ideas, facts, arguments, information. So the newspaper was born, and literature in its widest sense, including the book, the newspaper and the magazine, became the chief instrument of a nation's progress. The first half of the 18th century is remarkable for the rapid social development in England. Hitherto man had been more or less governed by the narrow, isolated standards of the Middle Ages, and when they differed, they fell speedily to blows. Now in a single generation, now for the first time they set themselves to the task of learning the art of living together while still holding different opinions. In a single generation, nearly 2,000 public coffee houses, each a center of sociability, spring up in London alone, and the number of private clubs is quite as astonishing. This new social life had a marked effect in polishing man's words and manners. The typical landowner of Queen Anne's day was still rude and a little vulgar in his tastes. The city was still very filthy. The streets unlighted and infested at night by bands of rowdies and Mohawks. But outwardly men sought to refine their manners according to prevailing standards, and to be elegant, to have good form, was a man's first duty, whether he entered society or wrote literature. One can hardly read a book or poem of the age without feeling this superficial elegance. Government still had its opposing Tory and Whig parties, and the church was divided into Catholics, Anglicans, and Dissenters. But the growing social life offset many antagonism, producing at least the outward impression of peace and unity. Nearly every writer of the age busied himself with religion as well as with party politics. The scientist Newton, as sincerely as the churchman Barrow, the philosophical Locke, no less earnestly than the evangelical Wesley, but nearly all tempered their zeal with moderation and argued from reason and scripture, or used delicate satire upon the opponents. Instead of denouncing them as followers of Satan. There were exceptions, of course, but the general tendency of the age was toward toleration. Man had found himself in the king. Man had found himself in the long struggle for personal liberty. Now he turned to the task of discovering his neighbor, of finding in Whig and Tory, in Catholic and Protestant, in Anglican and Dissenter, the same general human characteristics that he found in himself. This good work was helped, moreover, by the spread of education and by the growth of the national spirit. Following the victories of Marlborough on the content, in the midst of heated argument, it needed only a word. Gibraltar, Benham, Ramillies, Malplaquet, or a poem of victory written in a garret to tell a patriotic people that under their many differences they were all alike Englishmen. In the later half of the century, the political and social progress is almost bewildering. The modern form of cabinet government, responsible to parliament and the people, had been established under George I and in 1757. The cynical and corrupt premier of the first Tory cabinet were replaced by the more enlightened policies of Pitt. Schools were established, clubs and coffee houses increased, books and magazines multiplied until the press was the greatest visual power in England. The modern great dailies The Chronicle, Post and Times began their career of public education. Religiously, all the churches of England felt the quickening power of that tremendous spiritual revival known as Methodism under the preaching of Wellesley and Whitefield. Outside her own borders, three great men, Clive in India, Wolfe on the plains of Abraham, Cook in Australia, and islands of the Pacific, were unfurling the banner of St. George over the untold wealth of new lands and spreading the worldwide empire of the Anglo-Saxons. Dear friends, basics and fundamentals of the classical age are very necessary for knowing the deep study of the English literature. What are the literary characteristics of classical age? In every preceding age, we have noted especially the poetical works, which constitute, according to Matthew Arnold, the glory of English literature. Now, for the first time, we must chronicle the triumph of English prose. A multitude of practical interest arising from the new social and political conditions demanded expression, not simply in books, but more especially in pamphlets, magazines, and newspapers. Poetry was inadequate for such a task. Hence, the development of prose, of the unfettered world, as Dante calls it, a development which astonishes us by its rapidity and excellence. The graceful elegance of Gibbon's history and of Burke's orations, these have no parallel in the poetry of the age. Indeed, poetry itself became prosaic in this respect. That it used not for creative works of imagination, but for essays, for satire, for criticism, for exactly the same practical ends as was prose. The poetry of the first half of the century, as typified in the work of Pope, is published and polished and witty enough, but artificial. It lacks fire, fine feeling. It lacks fire, fine feeling, enthusiasm, the glow of the Elizabethan age, and the moral earnestness of the Puritanism. In a word, it interests us as a study of life, rather than delights or inspires us by its appeal to the imagination. The variety and excellence of prose works and the development of a serviceable prose style, which had been begun by Dryden, until it served to express clearly every human interest and emotions. These are the chief literary glories of the 18th century. In the literature of the preceding age, we noted two marked tendencies: the tendency to realism in subject matter and the tendency to polish and refinement of expression. Both these tendencies were continued in the Augustan age and are seen clearly in the poetry of Pope, who brought the couplet to perfection, and in the prose of Addison. A third tendency is shown in the prevalence of satire, resulting from the unfortunate union of politics with literature. We have already noted the power of the press in this age and the perpetual strife of political parties. Nearly every writer of the first half of the century was used and rewarded by Whigs or Tories for satirizing their enemies and advancing their special political interest. Pope was a marked exception, but he nevertheless followed the prose writers in using satire too largely in his poetry. Now, satire, that is a literary work which searches out the faults of men or institutions in order to hold them up to ridicule, is at least a destructive kind of criticism. A satirist is like a laborer who clears away the ruins and rubbish of an old house before the architect and builders begin on a new and beautiful structure. The work may sometimes be necessary, but it rarely arouses our enthusiasm. While these satires of Pope, Swift, and Addison are doubtless the best in our language, we hardly place them with our great literature, which is always constructive in spirit, and we have the feeling that all these men were capable of better things than they ever wrote. Dear friends, now you will know about this age, the classical age, the period we are studying is known to us by various names. It is often called, but unlike Elizabeth, this meekly stupid queen had practically no influence upon our literature. The name classic age is more often heard, but in using it, we should remember clearly these three different ways in which the word classic is applied to literature. The term classic refers in general to writers of the highest rank in any nation, as used in our literature. It was first applied to the works of Greek and Roman writers like Homer and Virgil, and any English book which followed the simple and noble method of these writers was said to have a classic style. Later, the term was enlarged to cover the great literary works of other ancient nations, so that the Bible and the Avestas, as well as the Iliad and the Aeneid, are called classics. Dear friends, our holy scriptures of the holy religions of the Holy Land are really praiseworthy, admirable for knowing the truth of literature and language. Every national literature has at least one period in which an unusual number of great writers are producing books. and this is called the classical period of a nation's literature. Thus, the reign of Augustus is the classic or golden age of Rome. The generation of Dante is the classical age of Italian literature. The age of Louis XIV is the French classic age, and the age of Queen Anne is often called the classical age of England. The word classic acquired an entirely different meaning in the period we are studying. We shall better understand this by reference to the preceding ages. The Elizabethan writers were led by patriotism, by enthusiasm, and in general by romantic emotions. Too many words. Their works are delightful. In the following age, patriotism had largely disappeared from politics and enthusiasm from literature. Poets no longer wrote naturally but artificially. Plastic verse forms to give effect, since fine feeling was wanting, and this is the general character of the poetry of the Puritan age. Gradually, our writers rebelled against the exaggerations of both the natural and style. They demanded that poetry should follow exact rules, and in this they were influenced by French writers, especially by Boileau and Rapin, who insisted on precise methods of writing poetry and who professed to have discovered their rules in the classics of Horace and Aristotle. In our study of the Elizabethan drama, we noted the good influence of the classical movement in insisting upon that beauty of form and definiteness of expression which characterized the drama of Greece and Rome, and in the work of Dryden and his followers we see a revival of classicism in the effort to make English literature conform to rules established by the great writers of other nations. At first, the results were excellent, especially in prose. But as the creative vigor of the Elizabethan was lacking in this age, writing by rule soon developed a kind of elegant formalism which suggests the elaborate social code of the time. Just as a gentleman might not act naturally but must follow exact rules in decoding, in doffing his hat, or addressing a lady, or entering a room. So our writers lost individuality and became formal and artificial. The general tendency of literature was to look at life critically, to imagination, the form rather than the content of a sentence. Writers strove to repress all emotion and enthusiasm and to use only precise and elegant methods of expression. This is what is intellectual spirit of many writers. To the fine polish of their heroic couplets or the elegance of their prose, and not to any resemblance which their work bears to true classic literature. In a word, the classic movement had become pseudo-classic. That is a false or sham classicism. And the later term is now often used to designate a considerable part of 18th century literature. To avoid this critical difficulty, we have adopted the term Augustan age, a name chosen by the writers themselves, who saw in prose addition, who saw in Pope, Addison, Swift, Johnson and Burke the modern parallels to Horace, Virgil, Cicero and all that brilliant company who made Roman literature famous in the days of Augustine. Alexander Pope, autobiography of Alexander Pope. History and life of Alexander Pope, who born in 1688 and died in 1744. Wrote in his poems, little knowledge is dangerous thing. He says in that poem, I am just picking up the pebbles from the vast ocean, by giving the example of the greatest scientist Newton. Further he says that much knowledge makes man humble, little knowledge makes man pride. Pope is in many respects, in the first place, he was for a generation the poet of a great nation. To be sure, poetry was limited in the early 18th century. There were few lyrics, little or no love poetry, no epics, no dramas or songs of nature worth considering. But in the narrow field of satiric and didactic verse, Pope was the undisputed master. His influence completely dominated the poetry of his age, and many foreign writers, as well as the majority of English poets, looked to him as their model. Second, he was a remarkably clear and adequate reflection of the spirit of the age in which he lived. There is hardly an ideal, a belief, a doubt, a fashion, a whim of whim, and his time that is not neatly expressed in his poetry. Third, he was the only important writer of that age who gave his whole life to letters. Swift was a clergyman and politician. Addison was Secretary of State. Other writers depended on patrons or politics or pension for fame and a livelihood. But Pope was first. By the sheer force of his ambition, he won his place and held it, in spite of religious prejudice and in the face of physical and temperamental obstacles that would have disgraced a strong man, for Pope was deformed and sickly. Dwarfish in soul and body, he knew little of the word of nature or of the word of the human heart. He was lacking apparently in noble feeling and instinctively chose a lie when the truth had manifestly more advantages. Yet this jealous, peevish, Wash Pish Littleman became the most famous poet of his age and the acknowledged leader of English literature. We record the fact with wonder and admiration, but we do not attempt to explain it. How was the life of Alexander Pope? His personal lifestyle, how was full of letters. Pope was born in London in 1688, the year of the Revolution. His parents were both Catholic, who presently removed from London and settled in Binfield, near Windsor, where the poet's childhood was passed, partly because of an unfortunate prejudice against Catholics in the public schools, partly because of his own weakness and deformity. Pope received very little school education, but browsed for himself among English books and picked up a smattering of the classics. Very early he began to write poetry and records the fact with his usual vanity, as yet a child, nor yet a fool to fame. I lisped in for the numbers came, being debarred by his religion from many desirable employments. He resolved to make literature his life work, and in this he resembled Dryden, who tells us was his only master. Though much of his work seems to depend on the Boileau, the French poet and critic, the only "16 years old, he had written his pastorals. A few years later appeared his essay on criticism, which made him famous. With the publication of the Rap of the Lock in 1712, Pope's name was known and honoured all over England, and the dwarf of 24 years, by the sheer force of his own ambition, had jumped to the foremost place in the English letters. It was soon after this that Voltaire called him the best poet of England and at present of all the world, which is about as near the truth as Voltaire generally gets in his numerous universal judgments. For the next 12 years, Pope was busy with poetry, especially with the translation of Homer, and his work was so successful financially that he bought a villa at Twickenham on the Thames and remained happily independent of wealthy patrons for a livelihood. Led by his success, Pope returned to London and for a time endeavoured to live the gay and dissolute life which was supposed to be tally and physically, and soon retired to Twickenham. There he gave himself up to poetry, manufactured a little garden more artificial than his verse, and cultivated his friendship with Martha Blount, with whom for many years he spent a good part of his day, and who remained faithful to him to the end of his life. At Twickenham he wrote his moral epistle, political satires, modelled after Horace, and revenged himself upon all his critics in the bitter abuse of the Dunciad. He died in 1744 and was buried at Twickenham, his religion preventing him from the honour which was certainly his due of a resting place in Westminster Abbey. Works of Pope. For convenience, we may the work into three groups, corresponding to the early, middle and later period of his life. In the first, he wrote his pastorals, Windsor Forest, Masiha, Essay on Criticism, Elegy to Aberland, and the Rap of the Lobe. His translations of Homer. In the third, the Dunciad and the Epistles, the latter containing the famous Essay on Man, and the Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot, which is in truth his apologia, in which alone we see Pope's life from his own viewpoint. The Essay on Criticism sums up the art of poetry as taught first by Horace, then by written in heroic couplets. We hardly consider this as a poem, but rather as a storehouse of critical maxims. For fools rush in where angels fear to tread. To err is human, to forgive divine. A little knowledge is dangerous thing. These lines and many more like them from the same source have found their way into our common and are used without thinking of the author whenever we need an apt quotation. The Rape of the Lobe is a masterpiece of its kind and comes nearer to being a creation than anything else that Pope has written. The occasion of the famous poem was trivial enough, a top at the court of Queen Anne and Lord Peter, abundant culls of a pretty maid of honor named Abrilla Fermor. The young lady resented it, and the two families were plunged into a quarrel which was the talk of London. Pope, being appealed to, seized the occasion to construct no done, nor an epigram as French poets love to do, but a long poem in which all the mannerism of society are pictured, minutest detail and satirized with the most delicate wit. The first edition, consisting of two cantos, was published in 1700, and it is amazing now to read of trivial character of London and court life at the time when English soldiers were battling for a great continent in the French and Indian wars. Its instant success caused Pope to lengthen the poem by 3 more cantos, and in order to make a more perfect bulk of an epic poem, he introduces gnomes, spirits, sylphs and salamanders instead of the gods of the great epics. with with which his readers were familiar. The poem is modelled after two phone satires, Boileau's Les Luctrines reading desk, a satire on the French clergy who raised a race quarrel over the location of a lectern and low Secchia Rapita, stolen bucket, a famous Italian satire on the petty causes of the endless Italian watch. Pope, however, went far ahead of his masters in style and in delicacy of handling a mock heroic theme. And during his lifetime, the Rape of the Lock was considered as the greatest poem of its kind in all literature. The poem is still well worth reading, for as an expression of the artificial life of the age, of its cards, parties, toilettes, lapdogs, tea drinking, snuff taking, and idle vanities. It is a perfect in its way as Tamburlaine, which reflects the boundless ambition of the Elizabethans. Dear friends, listen continue for extending your knowledge in English literature. The fame of Pope's Iliad, which was financially the most successful of his books, was due to the fact that he interpreted Homer in the elegant artificial language of his own age. Not only do his words follow literary fashions, but even the Homeric characters lose their strength and become the fashionable men of the court. So the criticism of the scholar Bentley was most appropriate when he said it is a pretty poem, Mr. Pope, but you must not call it Homer. Pope translated the entire Iliad, half of the Odyssey, and the later work was finished by two Cambridge scholars, Eliza Fenton and William Broome, who imitated the mechanical couplets so perfectly that it is difficult to distinguish their work from that of the greatest poet of the age. A single selection is given to show how, in the nobler passengers, even Pope may faintly suggest the elemental grandeur of Homer. The troops, exulting, set in order round, and beaming fires illuminated all the ground, as when the moon, refulgent lamp of night, over heaven's clear azure spreads her sacred light, when not a breath disturbs the deep serene, and not a cloud or a crest the solemn scene. Around her throne the vivid planets roll, and stars numbered gild the glowing pole. Over the dark trees a yellow verdure shed, and tip up the silver every mountain head. Dear friends, the essay is the best known and the most quoted of all Pope's works. Except in form, it is not poetry. And when one considers it as an essay, is it to plain prose, it is found to consist of numerous literary ornaments without any very solid structure of thought to rest upon. The purpose of the essay is, in Pope's words, to vindicate the ways of God to man. And as there are no answered problems in Pope's philosophy, the vindication is perfectly accomplished in 4 poetical epistles concerning man's relations to the universe, to himself, to society, and to happiness. The final result is summed up in a few well-known lines. All nature is but art unknown to thee. All chance direction which thou canst not see. All discord harmony not understood. All partial evil, universal good, and spite of pride in erring reason's spite. One truth is clear, whatever is right. Like the essay on criticism, the poem abounds in quotable lines such as the following, which make the entire work well worth reading. Hope springs eternal in the human breast. Man never is, but always to be blessed. Know then thyself. Presume not go to scan. The proper study of mankind is man. The same ambition can destroy or save, and makes a patriot as it makes a name. Honor and shame from no condition rise. Act well you part, there all the honor lies. Vice is a monster of so frightful mien, as to be hated needs but to be seen. Yet seen to all, familiar with her face, we first endure, then pity, then embrace. Behold the child, be nature's kindly law, pleased with their rattle, with a straw. Some livelier plaything gives its youth delight, a little louder, but as empty quiet. Scarfs greener, scarfs garters gold, amuses, riper stays, and beads and prayer books are the toys of age. Pleased with this babble still, as that before, till tired he sleeps, and life is poor place over. Thank you, dear brothers and sisters, dear friends, those who are listening. May God bless you. Please spread the message of language and literature through the words, thoughts, ideas, breaths, and insight of Dr. Rakesh from USA. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe positively. Thanks, scholars and learners. I respect heartily all of you. I once again thanks God who has given this wonderful opportunity to speak, read, write, and listen the holy scriptures of this holy land. Thanks, dear brothers. Thanks all of you. time and again.